Hello, my friends, and welcome to Sunday School. I'm so glad that you are taking the time to join with me today and to hear another story from the Bible. If you remember last week, we talked about Noah's Ark, and at the end of that story, we had God putting a rainbow in the sky as a sign of his promise never to flood the earth again. And this week, we have another story about a promise. This time, it's about Abraham and Sarah. This is a story that happens in the Old Testament, and God made a promise to Abraham that Abraham would have many, many children, that he would be the father of a whole great multitude of people. God said that Abraham's descendants would be as plentiful as the stars or the grains of sand on the beach, which is a lot. I mean, if you look up at the sky and you look at all the stars, there's a lot. You can't even really count them all. And that's what God's promise was to Abraham, is that Abraham's descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky. So today we're going to hear that story about how God kept his promise to Abraham. As we get started, would you please pray with me? Repeat after me. Dear God, we are so glad you always keep your promises. Help us to trust in you always and to know that no matter what, you are with us. Amen. Well, as I mentioned, today's story focuses on Abraham and Sarah. And they're going to have some visitors who stop by and speak to Abraham about God's promise. If you have a Spark Story Bible at home, you can find the story on page 34. You can pause the video here and go grab that story Bible if you'd like. And so as I said, page 34, and I'll put the words up here on the screen. Abraham and Sarah's visitors. When Abram was 99 years old, he and his wife Sarai were still waiting for God's promise of a huge family to come true. Abraham was getting frustrated. He asked God, "What are you waiting for?" God spoke to Abram, "I will keep my promise, and I will change your names. Instead of Abram, your name will be Abraham. Instead of Sarai, your wife will be Sarah." Abraham was afraid of what God said. He thought he was too old to become the father of so many people, and his wife was too old to have children. He fell on his face and peeked up with one eye. Could God really make such a thing happen? Later, as Abraham was sitting by the tent, he saw 3 strangers walking towards him. Abraham squinted into the sun and wondered who would be visiting him on such a hot day. "Hi," Abraham said when they arrived. "You must be tired from traveling. Would you like to sit down to rest and have some food?" Quickly, Abraham asked Sarah to make some bread. He ordered his servant to prepare some meat. Sarah stood hiding in the tent, listening to the visitors. Who were they? Why had they come to her house? And why were they talking about her? She leaned in a little closer. "Your wife, Sarah, will have a son," the visitors said to Abraham. Sarah started to laugh. Didn't they know that she was too old to have a child? The visitors looked up. "Why is Sarah laughing?" they asked. "Doesn't she believe God's promise will happen?" God's promise to Abraham did happen. Sarah had a baby boy and named him Isaac, which means laughter. Abraham and Sarah's family grew and grew and grew, and God blessed each generation with laughter and happiness. I hope you enjoyed that story about Abraham and Sarah and their visitors. Did you know that Abram and Sarai having their names changed, that was the first time that happens in the Bible? The first time that anyone's name was ever changed was in this story about Abram and Sarai turning into Abraham and Sarah. I think it's important to point out that Abraham and Sarah didn't have to do anything. to get God's promise. God did all the work. They didn't have to do anything to earn it. It was just God's goodness that made the promise happen. Oh, did you notice when it talked about Abraham falling on his face? That seems like kind of a silly image, doesn't it? But what that really means is that Abraham knelt down onto the ground and put his face to the ground, which was a sign of worship to God, that Abraham truly loved God. Oh, and I just love Isaac's name. Do you remember what Isaac's name meant? Laughter. I think it's a very appropriate name given Sarah's reaction to the news of having a baby. Uh, so I thought those were some good facts that I really wanted to point out to you from our story. At this point, I'm going to invite you to take out your leaflet if you have one. I have a copy of it on the website. Otherwise, you can just use a plain piece of paper for this activity as well. So if you have the leaflet, it looks like this. It has a top section and a bottom section. And what you're going to do is write your name up here on the top. And then if you have a friend or family member there with you, you can write their name on the bottom. And then you're going to decorate your name. You're going to make some name art. So you can draw some pictures around your name or write some words that tell people something about you. Okay? And don't forget to include yourself in the picture. Maybe if you have some pipe cleaner, you could shape that into a sculpture, a stick figure of you, or you could just draw yourself in there as well. And then do the same thing for your buddy, for your family member in the bottom half of that page. Make sure that you decorate their name as well with things that describe them. Go ahead and pause the video here and go ahead and do that activity. And then when you're done with that, come on back and we'll have a little bit more for you. Well, I hope you were able to come up with some great artwork that describes your name on your page there. And now I'm going to have you flip over that piece of paper or flip over your leaflet. And you should see an image that looks kind of like a table. And if you don't have the leaflet, that's okay. A plain piece of paper will work for this activity as well. So when people come to visit, it's pretty common that you would offer them some food and some shelter. And it was no different for Abraham and Sarah. So when guests would come, they would be welcomed with food and shelter. I want you to think about this. If 3 surprise guests came to your house, what would you feed them? Just take a few minutes and sketch out what that meal might look like. So you can draw it. Maybe if you have some Play-Doh, you could model it out of Play-Doh. I'll just give you a few minutes here and create that feast. What would you serve your guests if you had 3 surprise guests? Go ahead, again, you can pause the video here and do that activity. And when you're done, come on back. Well, I hope you were able to come up with a great, tasty feast to serve your guests. So today's story was really all about promises. Again, just like last week when we talked about Noah's Ark and God making the promise and using the rainbow as a sign of that promise, we have another example of how God keeps his promise this week. He makes that promise to Abraham and Sarah that they're going to have a child, that they're going to have this big family, and God keeps that promise. Even at the age of 100 years old, even in their old age, God was able to bring them a family. He was able to make good on his promise. And Abraham and Sarah were so happy to have this family. So I want you to think about that this week, that the promises that God keeps for you. Okay? And I've got a couple other things. I want you to maybe think about trying this week as a sign of this story. Okay, so I've got a few suggestions. Number 1, make a promise to a friend and keep it. Don't just make the promise, but make sure you keep the promise. Number 2, have a laughing contest. Sit down with your family and have a laughing contest to remember this story. Number 3, with your parents, bring some yummy treats to a neighbor that you don't know very well. And number 4, make a sign that says, God keeps promises, and post it on the bathroom mirror. All of those would be great ways just to be a reminder of this story and of how God keeps his promises. Okay? So I encourage you to do one of those things, or maybe more than one of those things, if that works for you. As we wrap up today, I invite you to pray with me one more time. Repeat after me. God of joy, thank you for your promises that bring great joy. Thank you for all the things that bring us joy. We know nothing is impossible for you. Amen. Well, as we wrap things up, my friends, I encourage you to look on the Sunday School webpage. There are some other activities that you can do that are tied in with this week's story. We have a coloring page, an activity page, and there's that family page, which has some questions and some activities that you can do together with your family to help remind you of this story this week. Okay. Also, looking ahead, if you would like to have leaflets at home for each week's lesson, please let me know so I can get those ready for you, and then set up a time to come pick those up at the church. Okay. So with that, my friends, may God bless you this week, and be well.